My name's John Barnett. I'm a professor in geography at the University of Melbourne. I'm a political geographer. Like many geographers, I'm interested in the way people interact with their natural environments, and as a political geographer, I'm particularly interested in the way those forms of environmental change create different kinds of social outcomes. Who wins and who loses from environmental change, and who wins and who loses from the solutions to environmental change. And in the next 3 weeks, I want to talk about climate change and the social aspects of climate change. And I'm going to illustrate most of the examples, or most of the examples I can provide are going to be from research I've done in the small island states in the South Pacific. One of the key themes, or one of the key messages of these lectures, is that while we tend to think about climate change as a big natural science problem, as something that is to be understood through general circulation models and models that are seeking to show the way the Earth's big systems and ecological systems are going to change in response to climate change. And we tend to think of this as an environmental problem, as a natural problem, as a force of nature about which we can't do very much about. I want to show you, and I'm going to explain to you, that actually it's very much a problem about people, it's very much a social problem, and that it's not a natural problem at all. It's actually a problem about social systems and the way they work. And I'm going to argue, in a sense, that climate change is a social justice problem, and actually there's lots that we can do about it. Even in the case of very small islands like this, in the middle of the Pacific, not many people living in them, theoretically not many resources at their disposal, yet there's still things that can be done, and it's still very much a story about people. So in these lectures, I'm going to use examples from places like this. These are little islands in the main atoll called Funafuti in Tuvalu. I'm going to use these examples to explain theories, ways of trying to explain the problem of climate change and who's going to win and who's going to lose from it. Today I just want to make a basic overview of this argument that I'm going to work through in the next 3 weeks, that climate change is a social problem. It's a social problem because it's our activities that are causing the emissions that are enhancing the greenhouse gas effect. Yes, there's some degree of natural greenhouse effect, absolutely, that's very important, but the enhancement of that that's making the planet warmer and changing climatic cycles, making extreme events more extreme and so on, are actually from human activities, particularly since the Industrial Revolution. So we cause this problem. Now, if we cause this problem, then presumably we can solve it. But, and it's a very important point, of course, that not everybody makes greenhouse gas emissions in equal degrees of responsibility. And we tend to think about that in terms of countries. And when we talk about this in the Climate Change Convention, we say some countries produce more emissions than others. But I tend to think about this in terms of class, that it's about rich people and poor people and people with degrees of incomes and how much they as individuals are responsible for producing emissions. And we're not certainly, the audience of this subject certainly won't all be equally responsible for the amount of emissions they produce. So here are a couple of examples. We know this is a city in China, lots of emissions because China is industrialising, but historically that city hasn't produced anywhere near as many emissions as a city like London, which has been producing lots of greenhouse gas emissions for 250 years or so. To this farmer in East Timor who has no electricity whatsoever and produces almost no emissions from his activities. So different degrees of responsibility makes us think that maybe the solutions we need to think about who has a right to emit, who has a right to produce emissions, and who doesn't have such a right to emit anymore. That's a social justice problem, it's a distribution problem. Climate change is a social problem too because it puts at risk things that we value. So here, for example, is a picture of a cemetery in the island of Majuro in the Marshall Islands. And in Majuro and in many islands in the Pacific, people bury their ancestors. It shows their attachment to the land. It signifies their ownership of land. It's showing respect for their ancestors, a very important part of their identity. Now, sea level rise and stronger storms are causing erosion and causing damage to these cemeteries. And that's just one example of many of the things that we value that climate change puts at risk. So if an island in the middle of the Pacific that nobody lives on disappears, nobody really cares. We care because it impacts upon people, and we care because it's going to impact upon us and the things that are important to us. But we hold different sorts of values, and we're not all equally at risk. Stockbrokers in New York have different kinds of values and very little risk perhaps to climate change to people who live in Majora and the Marshall Islands who have different sorts of values and are facing different kinds of risks from climate change. And we'll explain this in coming weeks. Climate change is a social problem too because it's our emissions that cause this problem, it's our social systems that mean that some people are more vulnerable than others, and so it's within our control and it's a product of our social systems. Requires us to adjust and to change to deal with this problem. We have to change the way we live to reduce our emissions to some degree in different places. We are going to have to change the way we interact with the environment, the way we interact with each other, the way we organise ourselves in order to deal with these changes that are coming that are posing risks to us. We're going to have to adapt in some way, and that too is a problem of social organisation. And we want to do these things ideally. We want to reduce emissions and we want to deal and adapt with climate change in ways that are fair. We don't want to have solutions to climate change that make inequality greater. We don't want the rich people to get richer and the very poor people to get poorer in our responses to climate change in terms of reducing emissions or in terms of adapting. So it's a very complicated problem. How are we going to reduce emissions across the planet in a way that's fair? How are we going to deal with these changes in response to climate change? How are we going to adapt in a way that's fair amongst all people? Complicated social issue. It's very much a social problem and very much a distribution problem. So I just want to think a bit more about this question of risks, because that's really where the emphasis of my 3 lectures is going to be, what the impacts of climate change might be and how we deal with them. So it's going to impact upon things that we need to live good lives, basic needs, and this is particularly for the case in people in developing countries. There's a relationship between malaria and dengue fever, mosquito-borne diseases, and climate. There's a relationship between diarrhoea diseases and climate, and there's clearly a relationship between disasters and people's health and disasters and climate. And so there's quite a lot of evidence that shows that climate change can have very significant public health impacts in much of the developing world, and indeed including in the country where I'm from, in Australia. Climate change is going to create new vectors of illness and disease in our country. And we value our health, it's important to us. It's going to impact upon food security, particularly again in developing countries, but not exclusively so. There are plenty of low-income people who are hungry or malnourished in developed countries as well. It's going to impact through production of food from the land and from the seas. It's going to cause changes in people's incomes. It may cause changes in food prices as well. And so climate change, and there's a lot of concern in the research that climate change is going to cause greater problems of hunger and malnutrition in the developing world in particular, but also perhaps for some groups in the developed world. It's going to impact upon clean water as groundwater lenses become more contaminated by salt. This is a particular problem in the Pacific, as rainfall becomes more variable. And it's going to have impacts on these basic need problems in places where there are already health problems and health systems are not very good, where there are already food problems and food security is a difficult problem to maintain, to manage, and in places where there's already problems providing people with clean water. Places like this, this is an informal house in Funafuti in Tuvalu, and you can see not very good waste disposal, lots of still water lying around which provides good breeding site for mosquitoes, quite low incomes, not very good water and sanitation systems. And so places like this we would say are highly sensitive or highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change on health. It's going to pose risk to development, and I'll talk about this more in a couple of weeks, to the things that we invest in, to provide us with cities and with the secure supply of things, transport, food, fuel and so on. These things are all going to be at risk from rising sea levels and from extreme events in particular. To jobs and economic growth, it depends on where people work and how economies are structured, but to some degree all our economies rely on the exploitation of the environment, but some economies more than others. So people who are making their money selling fish or growing food are more at risk than people who are trading in shares in New York. And economies that are more oriented around exporting food or fisheries or tourism are probably more at risk than those that are more into manufacturing and services. But to some degree, and particularly under high rates of climate change, it will be a significant factor in the economies of many countries and in employment in many countries, and it may be a significant factor in the global economy too. And responding to climate change will have impacts on the cost of living. If water becomes more scarce, it's going to become more expensive. If food becomes more scarce, it's going to become more expensive. If, as we reduce emissions, we price fossil fuel energy systems so that fossil fuels are more expensive, that will impact on cost of living too. Just some pieces of infrastructure all on the coast. These are the two bulk fuel storage systems that provide all the fuel for the main islands of Marshall Islands in the top corner and Niue in the bottom corner. All on the coast, all quite exposed to sea level and extreme events. So if these things are damaged, then these countries run out of fuel fairly quickly, and then the diesel generators that provide the electricity for these countries go down. The hospitals that require that electricity can't provide basic medical care and so on. And climate change poses risk to all sorts of social values, things that economists can't price, but which are nevertheless important. To communities, to the social networks that give meaning to people's lives and in which many people live their lives. They may lose land, disasters may impact upon their infrastructure, there may be some degree of forced migration. And I'll talk about these issues in subsequent weeks. May impact upon culture, and I'll explain this in subsequent weeks too, and may impact on the cost of living. So these are some examples from Niue. The timber that's required to make these canoes is quite scarce, and when a cyclone comes, the trees that make these canoes often get destroyed, and so a very important cultural practice, making canoes, becomes quite difficult and may become increasingly difficult under climate change. So the conclusion of this lecture is it doesn't help us maybe to think of climate change as an environmental problem, but rather that it's a social problem with environmental elements. And I'll expand on this in the coming 3 weeks. Thanks.